The wind came down from the mountains that evening like something half alive, dry and restless, tugging at the cedar posts that fenced the Ward ranch. Elias rode along the north line with his collar up and his eyes narrowed against the grit. He had lived out here 12 years since the fever took his wife, 12 years of watching the land harden under sun and frost. Folks in town said the Ward place was haunted by silence, and they weren't wrong. Silence had become his partner, his prayer, his punishment. The mare's hooves sank into soft sand near the arroyo. He was turning for home when he saw the black shapes wheeling overhead. Vultures, lazy and patient against the dying light. Instinct made him nudge the mare forward. The scent reached him first, sweat, blood, and dust mingled with sage. Then he saw her, a woman sprawled half in the wash, her dress torn nearly to the knees, one arm bent beneath her, hair tangled like river weed. Her lips moved, but no sound came until he knelt beside her. "Rancher," she rasped, voice thin as breath. "I'll be your wife. Just save me from the vultures." He stared down at her, unsure if she was delirious or desperate, maybe both. Her eyes fluttered once, the faintest flicker of fear or hope, then closed again. Elias lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was, how fragile her bones felt through the torn cloth. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fallen, and the cold carried knives. He set her on the bearskin by the fire, stripped off her wet shawl, and poured a tin cup of water over a cloth to clean the blood from her temple. She stirred once, mumbling something about a man and a river, then went still again. He sat back on his heels, studying her in the flicker of the flames, a stranger on his floor, brought by fate or folly. Her face was sharp with hunger, her hands rough from work, not the soft kind one might expect from town. He left a kettle on the stove and stepped outside to breathe. The stars were bright and pitiless above the black ridges. Somewhere far off, the coyotes began to sing. When he came back in, she was shivering beneath the quilt. He threw another log on the fire and pulled the chair close, boots crossed, rifle resting upright beside him. He didn't sleep. Every so often, he'd hear her murmur or shift, and each time he thought of his late wife, her fevered skin, her last wordless glance before the breath left her. The memory sat heavy as the night itself. At dawn, he found her sitting upright, the blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her eyes followed him cautiously. "You found me," she said softly. "Seemed that way. I won't stay long." Elias shrugged, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Didn't ask you to," she nodded, eyes on the steam. "Clara," she said after a while. "That's my name," he nodded back. Elias Ward. There was no handshake, no courtesy. Just 2 voices scraping against the silence. The next days passed slow as thawing molasses. She slept mostly, waking only to eat broth or water. Elias worked the fences, chopped wood, fixed the stovepipe, anything to keep his hands busy and his thoughts from circling back to the woman inside. When he came in at dusk, she would sometimes be sitting by the window, watching the snow fall, her shawl drawn close. Once, he saw her mending the torn edge of her dress with thread he hadn't realized she found. The neighbors noticed soon enough. Old Mrs. Porter, who sold him salt and sugar, squinted from behind the counter. "Heard tell you've got company up there," she said. "That true?" Elias took his supplies without answering. Silence again proved the only answer that fit. By the 3rd week, Clara could walk around the small cabin, though her steps were careful. She asked about the horses, the ridge, the nearest town. He answered in short phrases. When she tried to offer coin for his trouble, he shook his head. "Keep it. You'll need it when you go." Her face hardened a little. "You think I should?" "I think it's your choice." That night, she burned something in the stove, a scrap of lace maybe, or a letter. The smell of smoke lingered long after. Snow came early that year, blanketing the pasture and muting every sound. Elias found himself listening for her voice in the evenings. A small sound, but it filled the cabin in a way silence never had. She asked once about his wife. He didn't answer right away. Then, she died in spring. Took the light with her. "I'm sorry," Clara said. He gave a faint nod. "So am I." For a moment they sat like that, 2 people tied by losses too heavy to name. The fire crackled between them, and outside, the wind sang low through the pines, a hymn for the living and the nearly gone. Days stretched, and with them, something shifted. Elias noticed the way Clara folded his shirts with care, the way she stepped outside before dawn to scatter grain for the hens. She spoke little, but her presence softened the hard corners of the place. Still, there was a wall between them, not built of anger, but fear. One evening, as the snow turned the world white, he found her standing near the window, looking out toward the hills. Her reflection trembled in the glass. "They'll come looking," she said quietly. "Who?" "Men who think I belong to them." Elias watched her for a long moment. "Then they'll have to find you first." She turned to him, eyes dark with gratitude and sorrow. "You don't even know what I've done." He took a slow breath. "Don't need to." "You're breathing. That's enough." Outside, the wind died down, leaving only the soft hiss of snow on the roof. For the first time in years, Elias felt the quiet turn gentle instead of cruel. By the time spring's first melt trickled through the arroyo, the vultures had gone. What remained was a house no longer haunted by one ghost, but quietly inhabited by two souls learning to stand the cold together. Silence still lived there, but now it had company. The snow thinned with the coming of February, and the world turned from white to a kind of brown silence, earth showing through again, brittle and weary. The thaw brought with it the sound of dripping eaves and restless horses. Clara moved about the house now with steadier steps, her pale hands no longer trembling when she reached for the kettle or the broom. Elias watched her in quiet ways. He never asked where she came from or what left her in the arroyo, but he noticed the small things, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way her fingers hesitated over scars that weren't healed by time. When she worked near the window, her face caught in the morning light. There was something fierce and lonely about her, as if she had learned too young to defend herself from mercy. He began to leave the coffee pot half full in the mornings, knowing she'd pour what was left and drink it cold by the fire after he rode out. He noticed she'd started feeding his horses without being told, her hands slow and gentle on their necks. He didn't thank her, not out of pride, but because words between them still felt fragile, like thin ice underfoot. The first talk of her past came not from her lips, but from the nightmares. Elias woke one night to her cries, low, strangled sounds, half prayer, half terror. He lit the lantern and found her sitting up in bed, her breath quick and eyes wide. "It's just the dark," he said softly. She nodded, though her shoulders shook. "He used to come when it rained," she whispered. Elias waited, saying nothing. He knew better than to fill silence with comfort. After a long while, she said, "He was my husband, Rogan." The name fell like a stone between them. He drank. "Said I belonged to him. Every breath, every step. The night I ran, he tried to stop me. I thought I'd killed him. Maybe I did." Her voice broke then, the words turning to ash. Elias reached out and took the lantern from her shaking hands, setting it down between them. The light made a small golden circle on the quilt, enough to soften the edge of her shame. "Running don't make you guilty," he said finally. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw in his eyes not judgment but understanding, the kind that only grows from loss. In the days that followed, they spoke little of it, but something had shifted. The silence between them became less of a wall and more of a shared space, a kind of truce. Clara began to clean corners long ignored. She mended curtains, scrubbed the hearth, and washed old crockery that hadn't seen use since before Elias buried his wife. He didn't stop her. There was comfort in the sound of life moving again, a broom, a song half-hummed, a window opening to let in air that smelled faintly of thaw and pine. One afternoon, while tidying a small drawer in the bedroom, Clara found something that made her pause, a braid of hair tied with a faded blue ribbon. The strands were golden, dulled by age but still soft, wrapped carefully in cloth. She understood without needing to ask. That evening she brought it to him where he sat by the fire sharpening a knife. "This was in the drawer," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to pry." He looked up, the lamplight catching the gray at his temples. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he took the braid, turned it once in his hand, and offered it back. "Keep it," he said. "She wouldn't mind another soul remembering her." Clara hesitated. "It's not mine to keep." "Maybe it is," he said, his tone softer now. "Grief don't need to stay where it started." She held the braid in her hands, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, but sacred somehow. That night, she placed it on the windowsill where moonlight could touch it. Outside, the coyotes sang, their cries carrying across the valley. It sounded like mourning, but not only that, as if the world itself remembered and forgave in the same breath. When morning came, Elias found her already awake, stirring the fire. She wore his late wife's shawl around her shoulders, not out of vanity but warmth. He almost told her it suited her, the color, the quiet way she carried it. But he held the thought instead. They shared breakfast in near silence. Interrupted only by the scrape of spoons. "I dreamed again," she said finally. But this time it was different. "I was walking and no one followed." Elias nodded, folding his hands around his cup. "That's a good dream." Her smile was faint but real. It was. Later that week, the weather broke open. Blue skies, the first hint of warmth. Elias hitched the wagon to ride into town for supplies. Clara asked to come, and though he didn't answer right away, he found himself saying yes. The road into town was long and rutted, but the silence between them had changed, no longer heavy, just full. She watched the land roll by, the brittle grass, the half-melted snow, the buzzards circling high above the flats. In town, eyes followed them. Whispers rose from the porch of the general store, from the blacksmith shop. Clara kept her chin high. When Mrs. Porter came out to greet Elias, her gaze slid to Clara and narrowed. "She's with me," Elias said, his voice calm but final. No one said much after that. That night, when they returned, the air carried the smell of rain. Elias lit a lantern in the barn to check the horses. Clara stood in the doorway, her figure outlined by the soft light. "Do you ever stop missing her?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, then at the empty stalls. "No," he said. "But missing her don't hurt like it used to. Some things stay. They just stop cutting." She nodded, eyes shining with something she didn't name. When they walked back to the cabin, thunder rumbled far off in the hills, slow and deep, like the turning of old memory. The wind stirred the loose hair at her temple, and for a heartbeat, Elias reached as if to brush it back, but stopped himself. Inside, the fire glowed low, steady as a heartbeat. The braid still rested on the windowsill, catching the faint shimmer of lightning beyond the glass. In that flicker, both of them understood. Healing didn't come by forgetting what was lost, but by letting it live beside what remained. Outside, the coyotes began again, a lonely, beautiful chorus of things half lost and half found. The sky had the color of iron that morning, heavy and low over the ridges. Elias could smell snow in the air long before the first flakes came. He saddled the mare anyway. Supplies were running thin, and the town would be cut off once the storm hit. Clara stood on the porch, shawl drawn tight against the wind. "You don't have to go today," she said. He adjusted the reins. "If I don't, we'll be eating boiled beans for a week." Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes didn't soften. "Then come back before dark." Elias nodded, but he knew daylight would not wait for him. The road to town was quiet except for the groan of wind through the cottonwoods. Snow began to fall just as he reached Main Street, slow at first, then heavier, swirling between the hitching posts and the shuttered windows. Inside the general store, the stove burned low, and the air smelled of damp wool and tobacco. Sheriff Denton was there, leaning against the counter, hat tipped back. "Ward," he said with a nod. "Didn't expect you down from the ridge with the sky looking like that." "Needed flour and salt." Elias began setting what he needed on the counter, but the sheriff's tone made him pause. "Had a fella come through this week," Denton said. "Called himself Rogan Price, said he's looking for a woman. Claimed she's his wife, ran off near 4 months back. Told me she might have headed this way. Wore a ribbon on his coat, same as wedding lace." Elias didn't look up. but his hands went still. What's he want with her? Said she's his bylaw. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. I don't reckon you've seen anyone fits the talk. Elias lifted the sack of flour, met the man's eyes. Can't help you there. The sheriff nodded slowly, though doubt flickered in his gaze. I figured as much. Just thought I'd mention it. Fella said he's staying near the cross until the weather clears. Elias paid, left, and mounted without another word. The snow thickened as he rode home, the flakes stinging his face like small, cold truths. When he reached the ridge, the world had turned white. The wind drove sideways across the flats, and the ranch looked like a ghost under the storm. Fence lines buried, chimney smoke torn away before it rose. Clara met him at the door, eyes wide with worry. You're frozen through, she said, helping him with his coat. But when she saw his face, her voice faltered. What happened? Someone's asking after you, he said quietly. A man named Rogan Price. The blood drained from her face. She stepped back as if struck. He's alive. Seems that way. She leaned against the wall, clutching her shawl. He won't stop. I thought he was dead. Thought I'd left him under that bridge. Elias didn't ask how or why. He only said, he won't get you here. Outside, thunder rolled across the open plain, deep and distant. The wind rose until it shook the shutters. By nightfall, the storm had turned to sleet, rattling the windows like a hand against the glass. Elias banked the fire and checked the rifle by the door. He told himself it was habit, nothing more. But he stayed awake, listening. The horses stamped restlessly in the barn. The wind howled like some warning carried down from the hills. It was near midnight when the dogs began to bark, sharp, frantic. Elias was on his feet before the second bark. Clara had already risen from her chair, pale as the snow outside. Through the whirling dark, a light moved up the slope, a lantern swinging from a horseman's hand. The beam caught on a slicker coat, a rifle strapped to a saddle. He's here, Clara whispered. Elias opened the door. The wind blew in cold and fierce, scattering sparks from the fire. The man rode up slow, stopped at the edge of the porch. His face was lean and weather-burned, his smile too easy for the storm that surrounded him. Well, the stranger drawled, looks like I found my bride after all. Elias stepped forward, rifle low but steady. This ain't your land. The man's eyes shifted to Clara. Clara May, you got yourself a fine protector here. Shame he don't know the law. You're my wife by paper and by God. Ain't no storm or stray rancher changes that. She stood behind Elias, voice shaking but clear. You left me to die. Rogan's smile faded. You shouldn't have run. Elias's voice was quiet, flat. You heard her. She's not yours. Rogan shifted in the saddle, rain dripping from his hat brim. You'd raise a gun against the law for her? For what's right, Elias said. For a long moment, no one moved. The storm pressed around them, howling across the valley, wind snapping at coats and hair. Then Rogan spat into the snow. You think you can keep her? I'll come back, with papers or with men. Either way, she's mine. Elias didn't reply. He just stepped down off the porch, steady and deliberate, eyes fixed on Rogan. The man flinched, just slightly, then jerked the reins and turned his horse. Snow swallowed the sound of hoofbeats as he disappeared into the dark. Elias stood there long after, the rifle still in his hand, the storm tearing at his coat. When he finally turned back inside, Clara was standing near the fire, trembling but unbroken. He won't stop, she said softly. You don't know him. Elias set the rifle by the door. Then I'll be ready. She looked at him, at the man who had carried her out of the dirt, who said little but meant everything. You shouldn't have to fight my ghosts, she said. He gave a small, tired smile. They're here now. Guess that makes them ours. Lightning flashed outside, bright enough to paint the room in silver. For a heartbeat, their shadows merged against the wall, two figures standing together against a world that would not let them rest. The thunder came a breath later, long and low. The sound rolled over the land and was gone. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee, set one before her. Neither spoke for a long while. The wind battered the cabin, but inside it was warm, a fragile warmth, born of defiance. When she finally met his gaze, her voice was small but certain. You should have let me leave when I said I would. He shook his head. If I had, the vultures would have found you again. Outside, the storm raged until morning, tearing at the fences, drowning the world in white. But within those wooden walls, the silence that followed felt different, not emptiness, but a promise unspoken. By dawn, Rogan was gone, leaving only hoof prints in the snow and the scent of gun oil on the wind. Elias watched from the porch, rifle across his knees. Beside him, Clara wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. For the first time since she'd arrived, she wasn't afraid of the silence. She was part of it now, and within that silence, something steady began to grow. The thaw came slow that year. Days stretched long and heavy with the scent of wet earth and thawing pine. The snow that had guarded the valley melted into mud, and the creek behind Elias Ward's barn began to speak again, low, uncertain murmurs in the cold air. The ranch, once sealed in silence, now breathed with restless change. Clara rose early, her shawl drawn tight, helping to hang feed sacks and sweep the porch free of the muck that clung to their boots. Elias watched her from the barn door, saying little. Since the storm and the stranger's visit, a quiet current had moved between them, something uneasy, yet alive. She felt his eyes sometimes, the way one feels sunlight through thin curtains. In town, the whispers grew bolder. Men at the general store lowered their voices when Elias passed. A woman at the post office stopped writing her letter when Clara entered, as though decency itself hung in the balance. Word traveled faster than wagons, of the rancher who'd taken in a ruined woman, of sin dressed in calico. When Elias came home one afternoon, his hands red from mending fence wire, he found Clara by the porch steps, her sewing basket at her feet. A torn sleeve, his sleeve, lay across her lap. She mended it with careful precision, her head bowed. "They think I ruined you," she said quietly, the thread trembling in her hand. Elias leaned against the post, his shadow long over her shoulder. "You couldn't ruin what was already broken." She looked up, eyes wide with the weight of his truth. He didn't mean it cruelly, only honestly. There were years of silence behind that line, and the ache of graves he never tended. That evening, the air held the bite of lingering frost. Elias brought in wood, while Clara prepared coffee thick enough to hold a spoon upright. They sat opposite each other near the hearth, the fire crackling with the slow patience of things rebuilding themselves. Neither spoke. Their words had already been spent in glances and gestures, his care in refilling her cup before she asked, her steady mending of what once was his wife's old quilt. Later, as the wind brushed the window panes, Clara said softly, "You should have let me go." Elias looked toward the fire. "You'd have walked straight into the dark again." She gave a faint smile. "Maybe that's where I belong." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was a kind of mercy, a way of saying not anymore. Outside, coyotes called across the valley, their cries echoing like ghosts of old prayers. Inside, the small room held a fragile kind of peace. That night, Elias dreamed of his wife. He saw her standing by the fence, hair braided, smiling the way she did before illness took her voice. In the dream, she handed him a ribbon, faded blue, and said, "Don't let her walk alone." When he woke, the fire had burned low, and Clara sat by the hearth, wrapped in her shawl, eyes half closed. The ribbon from his dream was real. He'd left it on the mantel weeks ago, the one that once tied his wife's braid. Clara must have found it again. She looked up at him as if she knew she had trespassed into memory. "Couldn't sleep," she murmured. "Me neither," he said. For a long time, neither spoke. The quiet was heavy, yet it didn't hurt like before. It filled the space between them like a slow breath. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the coals. She took hers without a word. "I used to think," she said after a while, "that I'd be better off if someone just forgot I ever lived." He stirred his cup, the sound of the spoon soft against tin. "I tried that once," he said. "It doesn't work." Her eyes softened. The fire cracked once, sparks catching in the air before falling to ash. Days passed. The ranch began to green again. Shoots of grass broke through the frost near the barn, and the air smelled faintly of rain on dirt. Clara's strength returned. She rode short distances now, her skirt brushing against the saddle worn from Elias's years alone. He watched her from the corral, never far enough to intrude, never close enough to scare her off. They spoke of small things, feed prices, the fences, the coming spring drive, but beneath every word lay the weight of something unnamed. It was not romance yet, not even forgiveness. It was survival finding its reflection in another person's eyes. One evening, Clara placed a jar of wildflowers on the table. "They don't last long," she said, "but I thought the house might remember what color looks like." Elias nodded. "It's been a long time since it did." The next morning, the wind carried a whisper of trouble from the south. A rider seen at the trading post asking again for Elias Ward's land and the woman living on it. Rogan hadn't vanished after all. Elias said nothing to Clara, but his watchfulness grew. He cleaned the rifle by the window each night, oiled the latch on the barn door, kept the lantern burning later than usual. Clara noticed. She always did. When she finally asked, he said only, "The world has a way of coming back around." Her hand brushed his as she took the cup from him. It was accidental, or maybe not. He didn't move. For the first time in years, warmth reached a place in him long frozen over. As the wind moaned across the plains and the horses shifted in their stalls, the ranch stood like a small light in the vast darkness, a place both of refuge and reckoning, and though no vows were spoken, and no future promised, they both understood. Something had taken root between them, quiet and fierce as spring after a long winter. The world might still come for them, but tonight, beneath one roof, they were no longer strangers. Emotional tone and realization, quiet longing, moral defiance, and the fragile bloom of trust. This chapter marks the turning of the heart, from survival to human connection. Their silence begins to mean comfort, not distance. Their shared space no longer penance but a slow awakening. The night began with thunder. A dry, restless wind swept across the valley, dragging the smell of rain and lightning with it. Elias Ward stood on the porch, the sky bruised violet above the distant ridges. Storm clouds gathered like smoke from some unseen fire rolling toward the ranch. He'd known this feeling before, not the weather, but the warning it carried. The kind that made a man's blood hum low with old instincts. Inside, Clara moved quietly, folding blankets, checking lamps, her steps soft but certain. The wind caught her hair as she closed the shutters, a strand brushing against the scar on her cheek. She turned toward Elias, sensing something in his stillness. "What is it?" she asked. "Riders," he said simply. The word hung there, thin as a wire before it snaps. Lightning split the horizon. In the flash, 3 silhouettes appeared, horses kicking up dust and sparks as they galloped through the storm. Elias reached for the rifle by the door. Clara froze for only a moment before gathering the lantern and moving toward the barn. "Stay inside," he said. "I won't hide again," she replied. Their eyes met, her fear tempered by something stronger, something earned since the night he'd found her half dead in the dirt. Still, he gave her a look that said please, and she obeyed, though she left the barn door cracked enough to see. The riders came fast, their voices carrying over the thunder. Rogan rode in front, soaked, mean-eyed, his mouth twisted with liquor and hate. The 2 men behind him were strangers, rough hands, hired guns who'd already sold their decency for a few coins. "Ward," Rogan shouted, dismounting in the rain. "You've got my wife in there." "The law says she's mine." Elias stepped down from the porch, rifle in hand, the barrel glistening with rain. "You forfeited that claim when you left her to die," Rogan spat, mud streaking his beard. "You think I won't take her back? You think you can keep what's mine?" Elias didn't answer. Thunder did, shaking the ground beneath their boots. The first gunshot broke like a lightning crack. Elias dropped to one knee, firing once, clean and sure. One of Rogan's men screamed, spun, and fell into the mud. The other turned tail, horse kicking wild as he vanished into the storm. Rogan fired twice more, bullets tearing splinters from the porch beam, sparks flying where iron met stone. The rain fell harder, sheets of water blurring everything into chaos, fire from lightning striking a fence post, smoke rising through the downpour. Elias advanced, calm as a man mending fences. eyes locked on Rogan crawling toward his fallen pistol. He didn't notice Clara until she stepped out from the barn, her shawl darkened by rain, Elias's old revolver steady in her hands. Rogan froze, panting, half buried in the muck. His voice trembled between rage and disbelief. "You'd shoot me? Your own husband?" Clara's hand shook, but her aim did not. "You left me for dead once. I'm not yours to kill again." For a long, suspended breath, nothing moved but the rain. Then slowly she lowered the gun. The storm seemed to hush in that instant, as if the world itself held still to listen. Elias stepped forward, rifle low. Rogan looked up at him, defeated, eyes wide with the kind of fear only a coward knows. "Go ahead," Rogan whispered. "You'll hang for it." Elias shook his head. "You ain't worth the rope." He turned away. Behind him, Rogan groaned, clutching his side where the bullet had grazed him. The storm began to fade, thunder rolling further and further toward the horizon. When the sheriff arrived hours later, dawn was just touching the hills. The ranch yard was a ruin of mud and smoke, the fence smoldering where lightning had struck. Elias sat on the steps, hat brim low, rifle across his knees. Clara stood nearby, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair dripping down her back. Sheriff Denton dismounted slowly, his face carved with concern and the weariness of a man who's seen too many nights like this one. "Heard gunfire from town," he said. "What in hell happened here?" Elias didn't look up. A man came calling for something that wasn't his. Denton found Rogan where he'd fallen, pale and muttering, the wound bleeding but not fatal. He crouched down, sighed, then looked back at Elias. "I'll take him in. There'll be questions." "There always are," Elias said. Clara's gaze stayed fixed on the rising sun. The light caught her face in pieces, the bruise near her jaw, the dried blood on her sleeve, the quiet strength that had replaced the fear in her eyes. She breathed deep, as if filling her lungs for the first time in years. When the sheriff led Rogan away, neither Elias nor Clara watched him go. There was nothing left to see, only the tracks in the mud, already softening under the morning drizzle. Inside, the house smelled of smoke and coffee. Elias poured 2 cups, one for each of them, hands still shaking faintly, though he hid it well. Clara sat across from him, fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "I should feel something," she said. "Anger, maybe. Or relief," Elias nodded slowly. "Maybe you just feel empty. It's a start." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening in the firelight. "You saved me again." "No," he said. "You saved yourself this time." They sat in silence, the storm's echo fading beyond the ridges. The fire burned low, casting long, gentle shadows that stretched toward one another across the room. Outside, the vultures circled high, not over death this time, but over land washed clean by rain. The ranch, battered but standing, seemed to exhale. Elias looked at Clara, really looked, as though seeing not what she'd been, but what remained. Something unbroken, something alive. In that quiet amid ash and dawnlight, the space between them finally warmed. The air no longer carried fear or pity, only the steady rhythm of 2 souls who had survived the same storm, and somehow found each other on the other side. Emotional tone and realization, raw catharsis and moral reckoning. The violence burns through everything false, leaving only truth, that dignity, once reclaimed, is stronger than vengeance. Elias's silence turns human again. Clara's pain transforms into power. Together they stand not as savior and saved, but as equals bound by survival and unspoken grace. Spring came slow, as though afraid to disturb the quiet that had settled over the valley. Weeks passed since that night of thunder and gunfire. The ranch still carried its scars, a bullet mark in the porch beam, a patch of blackened earth near the fence. Yet the land had begun to soften. Grass grew through the ash. Birds returned to perch on the rail where smoke once rose. Life, in its quiet, stubborn way, refused to die. Elias Ward worked from dawn until dusk, rebuilding the barn one beam at a time. His shoulders ached, his hands bore fresh calluses, but there was a steadiness to his motion, a peace in the repetition. Clara worked beside him, her skirts catching sawdust and sunlight. She laughed once, soft, startled by her own voice, when a nail bent under her hammer, and Elias muttered something about city hands. In town, the talk had changed. The sheriff said little of that night, only that the law was satisfied. Rogan and his hired men had disappeared into rumor. Some claimed they rode south. Others whispered they never left the prairie at all. Whatever truth lingered, no one came asking questions. Instead, when Elias or Clara rode in for supplies, the stares grew shorter, the greetings more genuine. A few nodded in quiet apology, though no words were spoken. The barn rose slow but sure. Each plank, each nail, felt like an act of forgiveness. Clara scrubbed soot from the stones and replanted the small patch of herbs by the kitchen window. At night, they sat by the hearth, the fire's glow soft against their faces. Silence no longer pressed between them like a wall. It rested, warm and easy, like an old friend. One morning, Clara stood by the window, the braid of hair she had once found tied with blue ribbon in her hands. The light caught the strands, faded to the color of wheat. She turned it gently, fingers trembling. Then she laid it on the sill where the sun could reach it. Maybe she can rest now, she said. Elias looked up from where he was oiling his rifle. She already has, Clara smiled faintly. And you? He paused, wiping his hands on a cloth. Getting there. The day warmed. Elias hitched the wagon, and they rode to the edge of the property line, where the prairie opened like an ocean, and the wind carried the smell of rain and cedar. They said little. Words seemed smaller than what lived between them. When they returned, the sun was setting behind the hills, turning the whole world gold. That night, Clara brewed coffee the way Elias liked, strong, near bitter. They sat together near the fire, mugs in hand, the world outside quiet but alive with crickets and wind. "I've been thinking," she said finally. "When summer comes, I'll ride north. There's a widow in Cheyenne who takes in women looking for work. I could make a place there." Elias didn't answer right away. The fire crackled, filling the space where his voice might have been. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, deliberate, the way one speaks to a skittish horse. "You could," he said. "Or you could stay." Clara looked up, surprised. "Stay? As what, Elias? As your burden? As your—" He cut her off gently. "Not as debt. Not as pity, just as choice." The words hung between them, raw and simple. She stared into the flames, feeling their warmth on her face, their light in her eyes. For a long while she said nothing. Then she whispered, "I don't know if I remember how to choose." He nodded. "Then start here." Outside, the wind moved across the fields, carrying the smell of new grass and wet earth. The horses in the corral shifted softly, their tails swishing in rhythm. The world felt wider than before, not empty, but waiting. Later that night, as the fire burned low, Clara rose to pour more coffee. She caught her reflection in the darkened window. Not the woman who had crawled out of the desert, torn and trembling, but someone whole, someone remade by time and tenderness. She turned to Elias, who sat half asleep in his chair, hat tilted low. "You never asked where I came from," she said quietly. He opened one eye. "Didn't need to. Why not?" "Because you're here now," she smiled, a soft, disbelieving smile. "That simple?" He shrugged. "Life's too short for fancy reckonings." She thought about that, about reckonings and ghosts, about the vultures that once circled her in the desert, about the way his hands had lifted her out of death's reach. Perhaps he was right. Some debts didn't need counting. Some wounds didn't need naming. When dawn came, the sky was clear, the first full light of spring. Elias hitched the wagon again, and together they rode into town. The people they passed offered nods, cautious smiles. At the general store, Mrs. Porter pressed a loaf of bread into Clara's hands, just because. The simple kindness nearly undid her. On the ride home, they spoke little. The road shimmered in the morning sun, the wheels creaking in rhythm with the horses' slow, steady steps. Clara watched the horizon, vast, endless, forgiving. "Feels different," she said softly. Elias glanced over. "It's the same road, maybe," she said. "But I'm not the same woman," he nodded once. "Then it's a new road." By the time they reached the ranch, The wind had risen again, carrying with it the hum of prairie song, low, endless, and peaceful. That evening, Elias fixed the last plank on the barn door. Clara brought him a lantern and stood beside him as the final nail sank into the wood. They didn't speak. The barn gleamed faintly in the lantern light, rebuilt from ruin into something whole. When they walked back to the house, the moon hung low over the plains, silvering the grass, the fences, their shadows side by side. Clara paused at the porch. "I'll decide by summer," she said. Elias nodded. "Whatever you choose, you'll ride free." She looked out over the land, their land now, in all but name, and breathed deep. The wind brushed her cheek, gentle as a benediction. Inside, the fire waited. So did tomorrow. And as the night settled over the valley, the world seemed to whisper its own quiet truth. That love, when earned through mercy and silence, needed no vows, only the courage to stay. Emotional tone and realization, resolution, rebirth, and gentle love. The story closes with quiet grace. 2 broken lives made whole not through possession, but through freedom. The tone is poetic, redemptive, and deeply human. A peace found in the aftermath of storms. A home rebuilt not from wood and nails, but from trust.